The moment Violet Morgan stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1879, she pressed her left wrist hard against the seam of her skirt and told the first person who looked at her too long that her name was Clara Webb. The town of Harlan Creek sat at the edge of nowhere, nestled between scrub brush and red clay hills in a valley that smelled of horse leather, cedar smoke, and the distant promise of rain. The main street was a single ribbon of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a saloon with a tilted sign, a church with half its shingles gone, and a sheriff's office where a deputy was sleeping in a chair on the porch with his hat over his face. It was the kind of town a person could disappear into if she was careful, or fall apart in if she wasn't. Violet was 24 years old and she intended to be careful. She had one leather traveling bag, a coin purse with $11.40 inside it, a forged letter of reference signed by a man she'd never met, and a brand on the inside of her left wrist that marked her as property of the Hargrove cattle operation out of Abilene. Except that she was not property. She had never been property. She had been an indentured worker on the Hargrove ranch, contracted at 16 by a father who drank and owed debts, and the brand, a crooked H inside a circle, had been applied without her consent on a night she still could not fully bring herself to think about without her hands going cold. The contract had run 7 years. She had left at the end of 6, before the 7th year's debt was settled, and that was the reason for the forged name and the forged letter and the $11 that had to stretch until she could find honest work. She had not come to Harlan Creek by accident. She had come because a woman named Dora Finch, who had passed through Abilene on her way west the previous autumn and taken a meal at the Hargrove cookhouse, had told Violet in a quiet voice while nobody was watching that there was a ranch east of Harlan Creek called the Ellsworth Spread. That the man who ran it, Jonas Ellsworth, was known to be fair. That he paid real wages, not scrip, not deductions. That he didn't ask questions he didn't need answers to. Violet had held onto those words for 5 months before she used them. Now she stood in the street with her bag at her feet and the afternoon sun on her shoulders like a warm hand pressing her forward, and she asked a woman sweeping her porch where she might find the road to the Ellsworth ranch. The woman, heavy-set and kind-faced, leaned on her broom and looked Violet over without malice. "That be the East Road," she said. "About 4 miles out. You looking for work?" "Yes, ma'am." "Jonas Ellsworth runs a decent operation," the woman said. "My husband sold him beef before. He's a quiet man but not a cold one. You know anyone out there?" "No," Violet said. "I was told he was a fair employer." The woman nodded slowly. "Word travels," she said. "You're not the first one to come looking based on word." Violet thanked her and picked up her bag. The East Road was 4 miles of dry red earth lined with mesquite and wild sage, and the occasional blackbird sitting on a fence post like a small, solemn judge. She walked the entire distance. She could not afford to hire a horse, and she would not ask anyone for a ride because she couldn't afford the conversation that would come with it. She walked steadily, her chin level, her wrist pressed against her skirt, and she rehearsed what she would say when she arrived. She would say her name was Clara Webb. She would present the letter. She would say she had experience in a ranch kitchen and with livestock, which was true, and that she was willing to work for fair wages and a place to sleep, which was also true. She would not mention Abilene. She would not mention Hargrove. She would not mention the brand. She had been repeating this plan so reliably in her head for so many weeks that it had almost lost the shape of a plan and started to feel like the outline of a real life. Almost. The Ellsworth Ranch came into view around a long bend, and Violet stopped walking for a moment just to look at it. It was not the largest spread she had ever seen, the Hargrove operation dwarfed it, but it had a quality the Hargrove Ranch had never possessed, which was that it looked cared for. The main house was 2 stories, white painted, with a wraparound porch that sagged only slightly at one corner. The barn was red and solid. The fence lines were straight and mended. There were cattle in the far pasture, a good-sized herd, and 2 horses in the paddock nearest the house, and a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that was just beginning to show green. There was also a man on the porch, and he was watching her approach. Jonas Ellsworth was 31 years old, and he had the look of a man who spent the majority of his time outdoors and never thought much about it. He was lean and weathered, with dark hair that had been sun-touched to a warm brown at the ends, and he had a face that was neither handsome in any theatrical sense nor plain, but rather the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. He was holding a cup of coffee, and he did not set it down when she came through the gate. He simply waited the way a man waits who is not easily startled. "Good afternoon," he said when she reached the porch steps. "Good afternoon," Violet said. She had been rehearsing, and so the words came out steady. "I'm looking for Mr. Jonas Ellsworth. You found him. My name is Clara Webb." She reached into her bag and produced the letter. "I was told you might have need of a cook and a hand for light outdoor work. I have a reference." He took the letter. He held it for a moment, and then he set it on the porch railing without reading it, just set it down on the wood and looked at her instead. "Where did you walk from?" he asked. She had expected him to read the letter. She had not expected that question. "Town," she said. 4 miles, he said, "in those shoes." She looked down at her shoes, which were sensible enough but clearly not made for a 4-mile walk in dust. "Yes," she said. "Are you hungry?" The question caught her so completely off guard that for a moment she could not answer it. She had prepared for scrutiny. She had prepared for suspicion and doubt and the careful performance of a name that was not hers. She had not prepared for the plain and uncomplicated concern embedded in that question. "I am," she said finally, and her voice was only barely level. "Come in then," he said. He picked up the letter as he passed the railing, folded it, and tucked it into his breast pocket without another word about it. The kitchen of the Ellsworth house was large and warm and smelled of coffee, and something that had been stewing for hours. There were 2 ranch hands sitting at the long table, a young Mexican man named Teodoro who couldn't have been older than 19, and an older man, gray-whiskered and bandy-legged, who introduced himself as Prentice. And they made room without being asked, and Jonas Ellsworth set a bowl in front of her that contained beef stew with potatoes and soft bread on the side, and she ate it with the focused and unashamed gratitude of someone who had not eaten a real meal since morning 2 days ago. Nobody asked her anything while she ate. Jonas refilled her coffee when she finished the stew. Teodoro and Prentice went back to talking about a fence post that had shifted in the night and needed to be reset. The dog, a large rust-colored animal of indeterminate breed, came and put his head on Violet's knee, and she put her right hand on his ears and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, something close to safe. When the bowl was empty, Jonas sat down across from her. "What experience do you have?" he asked. She told him the truth about her experience, the kitchen work, the butchering and curing, the livestock feeding, the garden, and she only changed the location, calling it a ranch near Waco rather than Abilene, belonging to a family named Kendall rather than Hargrove. He listened. He asked quiet, practical questions. How many head of cattle had she helped care for? Did she know how to preserve meat? Could she manage the garden through a dry season? She answered each one honestly, and she watched him nod at each answer with a thoughtful steadiness that told her he was actually listening, not just waiting for her to stop talking. "I have a room off the kitchen," he said at last. "Small. I should tell you it doesn't have a window, just a vent in the wall. There's a curtain for the door. Wages would be $9 a month, meals included." $9 a month was not generous. It was not unfair either. "That suits me," she said. "Good." He stood and picked up his coffee cup. "There's a wash basin in the kitchen you're welcome to use tonight. Teodoro can show you the well in the morning. We start at sunup, all of us." "I understand." He moved toward the door that led to the rest of the house, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. Not at the letter, not at her wrist, at her face. "Miss Webb," he said, and something in his tone made the false name feel briefly, strangely like a wound. "You're welcome to stay as long as the work suits you. This is a working ranch, not a complicated one. I don't have rules beyond the honest ones. Do the work, treat the animals and people with decency, and we'll get along fine." "Yes, sir," she said. He nodded and left the room. Violet sat alone in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone. The dog was still at her knee. Outside the window, the sun had dropped to a low, red angle over the hill, and the cattle in the far pasture were moving slow, the way cattle do when the day's heat is easing. She pressed her left wrist against her skirt, a habit so automatic she barely noticed it anymore, and she breathed. She would do the work. She would be Clara Webb. And she would not, she told herself with careful firmness, let herself want anything beyond that. The first week at the Ellsworth Ranch passed in a kind of focused blur of labor and orientation that Violet was deeply grateful for, because it left no room in the days for the anxiety that waited at the edges of her mind. She was up before the sun every morning to start the breakfast fire, and she learned quickly that the way to Jonas Ellsworth's general good humor was to have coffee ready when he came in from the morning check of the cattle. He was not a man who spoke much before he'd had his first cup. After it, he was easy enough to talk to, practical, clear, occasionally dry in his humor. But before it, he moved through the kitchen in a quiet, serious way that she found oddly comforting rather than intimidating. She cooked breakfast for four herself, Jonas, Teodoro, and Prentice, and after breakfast she did whatever the day required. In a cattle ranch kitchen in 1879, that meant baking bread, preserving whatever was in season, managing the garden, helping with the occasional butcher, doing the laundry, mending and feeding the two working dogs and the barn cats. It was not easy work, but it was fair work, and she was paid for it, and nobody looked at her like she owed them anything beyond what she had agreed to owe. Prentice was friendly in the garrulous way of old men who have been outside too long and want nothing more than someone to listen to stories about rivers they'd crossed in 1852. Teodoro was shy and earnest and treated her with a formality that she quickly understood was respectful rather than cold. And by the end of the first week, they had fallen into an easy working friendship in which he helped her carry water, and she taught him how to make the cornbread the way her mother had made it, with a cup of buttermilk and a spoonful of honey. Jonas she understood less, but she observed him carefully in the way she had always observed people, quietly, from the periphery, cataloging what mattered. He was not a sociable man, but he was not an isolated one. He knew every person in Harlan Creek by name and asked after their families when they came out to the ranch. He was direct in business, straightforward in disagreement, and careful with his land in the way a man is careful with something he plans to leave behind better than he found it. His wife had died 3 years before Violet arrived. She learned this from Prentice, who mentioned it without any particular weight, the way you mention weather, and there were no children in the house. He had a horse named Roscoe, a big palomino with opinions about everything, and Violet saw the difference between the Jonas Ellsworth who managed people and the Jonas Ellsworth who was around that horse. Something loosened in him around Roscoe. He talked to the animal in a low, easy voice, and laughed at things the horse did in a way he didn't quite laugh anywhere else. On the 8th morning, Violet was reaching past the stove to get the bread pan from the upper shelf, and she miscalculated the angle, and her left sleeve, the one she kept buttoned at the wrist at all times, always, even in summer heat, caught on the edge of the shelf hook and pulled back 3 inches before she could stop it. She yanked the sleeve back immediately. She kept her back to the room, and she breathed very slowly, and she stood there for 2 counts of 3 before she turned back to the stove. Jonas was at the kitchen table. He had been reading through some papers about a land survey, and she could not tell from looking at his face what he had and had not seen. His expression was exactly what it always was in the morning before his second cup of coffee, not closed, not open, simply present, attending to the moment. He did not say anything about it. She did not say anything about it. She put the bread in the oven and began to cut the salt pork for the pan, and neither of them broke the silence. And she told herself this meant nothing, except that all morning she felt his awareness of her like a new quality in the air, careful and gentle and absolutely not intrusive, and she didn't know what to do with that. 3 days later, he came into the kitchen in the late afternoon carrying a strip of soft leather, the kind used for the finer detail work on saddles, and a small jar of liniment, and he set them both on the kitchen table without comment. She was rolling dough, and she looked at the leather and the liniment and then at him. "The leather makes a good wrist wrap," he said. "Keeps the sun off and the dust out. It's clean." He did not look at her wrist. He looked at the dough she was rolling. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door and settled it on his head. "I'll be at the south fence until supper," he said, and he walked out. Violet stood very still in the kitchen for a long time. The dough was still under her hands, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the low angle that meant another 2 hours of working day. And outside, she could hear the distant sound of Roscoe's hooves on the hard ground as Jonas rode out. She picked up the leather strip. It was precisely the right width. She picked up the liniment and opened the jar, and the smell of it was cool and medicinal and kind. She sat down at the kitchen table and she unbuttoned her left cuff, and she looked at the brand, which she usually avoided doing. The H in the circle, scar tissue raised and pale against her skin, not large but undeniable. She put the liniment on it carefully. She wrapped the leather around her wrist and tied it. Then she buttoned her cuff over it, and for the first time since she'd left Abilene, the constant friction of the fabric against the scar was muffled, and her wrist felt easier. She went back to her dough. That evening at supper she noticed Jonas did not look at her wrist, and she noticed Prentice and Teodoro noticed nothing at all, which was exactly how she would have wanted it. And she thought about what it meant that Jonas Ellsworth had seen something she was hiding, had done something about it that cost him nothing but the price of a leather strip and a small jar of liniment, and had managed to do it in a way that required her to feel neither exposed nor indebted. She had met perhaps 2 people in her life who were capable of that kind of consideration, and one of them was dead. She started, against her best intentions, to think about him. It was not dramatic, this thinking. It was not the kind of romantic dreaming she might have indulged in at 16 before she understood how the world worked. It was more careful than that, more deliberate, a noticing of things. The way he laughed at Prentice's stories, reluctant and genuine. The way he always gave the dogs their dinner before his own. The particular look on his face when the cattle were moving well across the pasture, the quiet satisfaction of it, as if the world was doing what it was supposed to do. She noticed that he never came into the kitchen without knocking or announcing himself in some way, always a footstep heavier than usual or a deliberate clearing of the throat, and she understood this was consideration for her, giving her space to collect herself before he entered. She noticed he asked her preference before he made decisions that affected the kitchen, unlike any employer she had ever had. She noticed he read in the evenings by the lamp in the sitting room, history mostly, and the occasional surveyor's report, and that he fell asleep in his chair at least twice a week and woke himself in a way that was endearingly annoyed. The town of Harlan Creek had a general store run by a man named Abelson, and once a week on Saturday Jonas drove the wagon in for supplies, and whoever was available came along. Violet came along the second Saturday, and she was standing at the dry goods counter looking at thread when she heard the conversation at the back of the store. 2 men, one of them the deputy who had been sleeping on the porch the day she arrived, talking about a bulletin that had come in from the Abilene Sheriff's Office about a contracted worker who'd left the Hargrove operation before her contract was settled. The description was general young woman, brown hair, medium height, and they were talking about it in the lazy way of men who didn't particularly care about the outcome. "Hargrove's always putting out those bulletins," one of them said. "Half his workers run off." "Can't blame them," said the other. "Old Hargrove's operation has a reputation. Still, woman left 6 months before contract's up. That's a legal matter." Violet did not move. She kept her hand on the spool of thread she had been examining. She kept her face still, and her breathing slow. She paid for the thread with 3 cents of her own money, and she walked back to the wagon and sat on the bench and waited. And when Jonas came out with a sack of flour over one shoulder and Teodoro carrying the cornmeal behind him, she watched Jonas settle the supplies in the wagon bed and climb up beside her, and she said nothing. He drove the wagon back out of town, and about a mile down the road he said, without looking at her, "Abelson's got a new bulletin board up. Puts things on it that have come in from other towns." "I saw," she said. A long pause. The wagon creaked. Roscoe was hitched to the wagon today, walking in the steady, slightly resentful way he walked when he was doing job he considered beneath him. "Do you need to move on?" Jonas asked. The question was plain, not accusatory, not frightened, just plain. "No," she said, and then because he deserved more than a single syllable from her, she said, "Not yet. The matter those men were discussing, it's not a criminal one. It's a contract dispute." "Contract disputes can be made to look like other things," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for another quarter mile. "I'm not going to turn you in," he said. "Not over a contract dispute. Not over anything that isn't harm to someone." She looked at him then. He was watching Roscoe's ears, which were twitching in the direction of a jackrabbit that had bolted from the brush. "You don't know what I've done," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know what I've seen. 5 weeks of a person who does good work and treats people right, that's what I know." She turned back to the road ahead. Her chest felt tight in a way that wasn't unpleasant. "You read the letter," she said, though she'd been certain for weeks that he hadn't. "I read it," he said. "It's a competent forgery," she stiffened. "I've seen worse," he said. "I don't care about a forged letter, Clara." Her false name in his mouth felt worse than it ever had. It felt like a small and patient wrongness, a stone in a shoe. "My name is Violet," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out on its own, the way true things sometimes do when you've been holding them back long enough that they find their own exit. "Violet Morgan." He didn't look surprised. He didn't look anything in particular. He just nodded once in the slow way that meant he was filing the information away carefully. "Violet," he said, trying it out. "Yes." "That suits you better," he said. And he said nothing else about it until they were back at the ranch and unloading the supplies. And then he addressed her as Violet as naturally as if he always had. It was Teodoro who figured it out first, because he was 22 years younger than Prentice and therefore significantly more observant. He said nothing to anyone about it. He simply began to find small reasons to give Violet and Jonas the space of the same room, and he did it with the subtle and cheerful efficiency of someone who thought he was being very clever and was entirely correct. The weather in late May broke open in a spectacular way. A line of thunderstorms came rolling in from the southwest over 2 days and dumped more rain on the valley than it had seen in 3 months combined. The cattle were manageable, but the south fence, the same fence Prentice had been talking about on Violet's first day, the one with the problematic post, went down in the first night's storm, and by morning 3 of the fence posts were over and a section of the cattle were in the wrong pasture. All 4 of them spent the better part of the day in the rain moving cattle and resetting posts, which was miserable work in the mud and the wind, and Violet did her share of it without complaint, though she was not built for fence posts the way Prentice and Teodoro were. She drove the cattle. She'd driven cattle before, on foot and on horseback, and she was good at it. She understood the way a herd thought, which was not individually but as a single nervous organism that could be redirected if you approached it right. Jonas watched her work the cattle in the rain with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. By late afternoon the fence was up and the cattle were where they should be, and all 4 of them were wet through and covered in red mud. Violet got to the kitchen first and started the stove and put the large kettle on, and when Jonas came in he found the kitchen warm, and the coffee started and Violet at the table with her boots off and her hair down for the first time he had ever seen, because her braid had come out in the wind and she'd given up on it somewhere around the 4th fence post. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. Her hair was dark and long, drying in loose waves around her face, and she was rubbing her hands together over the heat of the lamp because her fingers were cold, and she looked up when she heard him stop. He looked away first. "Thank you," he said, meaning the coffee, moving to the stove to pour it. "The south section is holding," she said. "I think the third post from the end needs another foot of depth." "I know," he said. "I'll do it in the morning when the ground's not soup." She nodded. He sat down at the table across from her. Their wet boots were both under the table, and the kitchen smelled of rain and coffee and wood smoke, and there was something about the specific combination of those things, in that moment, that made Violet feel a sudden and overwhelming sense of rightness that scared her a little. She had felt that feeling before in the first weeks here, and she had suppressed it with great success. But it was harder to suppress when her hair was down and her guard was low from cold and work and exhaustion. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can," he said. "Why did you keep the letter in your pocket when you read it and knew it was forged?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and thought about it for a moment. "Because someone who forges a letter and walks 4 miles to a job interview is someone who needs work, not someone who wants trouble," he said. "And I needed a cook." The two things seemed to settle each other. She watched him. That's simple, he said. "Most men would have sent me back." "Most men," he said, "would have read that letter first and then looked at you to see what story they could make fit the details." He looked at her steadily across the lamp's light. "I looked at you first." Violet was quiet. Outside the rain was lessening, the thunder moving east, and the first stars of the evening were starting to appear at the edges of a breaking sky. "What did you see?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than she'd intended. He considered this with the same careful attention he gave everything. "Someone who'd been handled badly," he said, and was trying to make sure it didn't show. She looked down at the leather wrap on her wrist. The leather was damp from the rain. "It showed," she said. "Not the way you think," he said. "Not as a weakness, more like a person who knows the weight of a thing but is carrying it anyway." She didn't say anything for a long moment. The kettle was starting to hiss. "I was contracted to a ranch outside Abilene," she said. "My father sold the contract when I was 16. 7 years of labor in exchange for a debt he had. It was legal." She said that last word with a flatness that contained the whole of its wrongness. "I left after 6 years. The debt for the last year is what they're looking for me for." "How much?" Jonas asked. $40. He was quiet. "I know," she said. "I know it sounds small. But to me at 16 it was." She stopped. "My father thought he was solving a problem. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who drank and made bad decisions, and there's a difference, and it took me years to understand that the difference doesn't change the outcome." "No," Jonas said. "It doesn't. The brand." She stopped again. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to." She looked up at him. "That's why I'm going to. The brand was applied in the first year. I didn't agree to it. It was on a contract I signed at 16 without understanding what I was signing. It says Hargrove owns me. He doesn't. He never did." She met his eyes and her voice was level and direct and entirely without apology. "I want you to know what's on my wrist is not a thing I chose." "I know," he said. "I knew that 5 weeks ago." She exhaled slowly. The rain outside had stopped entirely, and the silence after it was the kind of silence that has texture, full of a world dripping and cooling and settling. "I don't know what you need," he said after a moment. "That is, I mean, I don't know what would help you. The situation with the contract. Whether there's something I can do or whether you just needed someone to know. Both of those are legitimate." Violet looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man who had read the wrong name in a forged letter and set it down and fed her soup instead, who had left liniment on a table and walked away, who had let her tell him her real name at her own pace, who had just sat in the rain in a broken pasture and watched her drive cattle without once implying she couldn't, and she felt the rightness of this particular moment press against her chest like a hand. "I think," she said slowly, "I need $40. He was quiet for a count of 3, and then the dry humor that lived just below the surface of his serious face broke through. "I can manage that," he said. She shook her head. "Not as a gift. As an advance on wages, I'll work it off." "You'll be here 4 months at minimum then," he said. "I can live with that." "More than 4 months," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them in that look that neither of them was quite ready to name, and both of them felt clearly. "Good," he said. The following week Jonas drove into Harlan Creek alone and came back without explaining what he'd done. But 3 days after that, the bulletin about the Abilene contract dispute disappeared from Abelson's board, and a week after that Prentice came in from the post in town and reported to nobody in particular that the county clerk had logged a contract resolution between some cattle outfit and a worker named in the books. And Violet, who was chopping carrots, went very still for a moment and then went back to chopping. The $40 had gone to Hargrove. Through a proxy, she would later learn, a lawyer in Abilene named Cates who sometimes handled these matters. It was legal and quiet and final. The contract was settled and closed, and there was no more obligation and no more record of it being unpaid. Violet did not cry about it. She had learned not to cry in circumstances where crying seemed like it would be useful, because it almost never actually was. But when Jonas came in for supper that evening, she met his eyes and she said, "Thank you," and she meant it in the full and complete sense of the phrase, all the way to its foundation. $40, he said. 4 months, we said. 4 months, she agreed, and they both knew that was not the point. Summer on the Ellsworth Ranch was the kind of season that starts hard and then breaks into a generous beauty, the way Texas sometimes does when it decides to be merciful. July brought the heat in full force, dry and relentless, and Violet learned the rhythms of a cattle ranch in summer, which were different from the rhythms of spring. The mornings were still early, but the hardest outdoor work was done before noon, after which the heat made serious effort dangerous, and the smarter choice was to rest and do the quieter work in the shade. She spent the afternoons in the kitchen garden, which she had taken as her particular project, and it was transforming steadily under her attention. She'd planted okra and tomatoes and sweet peppers and winter squash, and had convinced Jonas to let her put in a small herb bed along the south wall, which he had agreed to with a slight bewilderment about herbs in general, as if the concept of something being both planted and edible but not a vegetable was a new taxonomy he was still integrating. She brought him a sprig of rosemary one afternoon and laid it on the table next to his coffee with no explanation. He picked it up and smelled it and looked at her with an expression of genuine puzzlement. "What do I do with it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I just thought you should smell it." He smelled it again, more deliberately this time, and then set it down with the expression of a man who has been given information he is still processing. "All right," he said. She went back to the garden. He watched her go. These were the exchanges that were becoming the particular vocabulary between them, not declarations, not conclusions, but small gestures and quiet jokes, and a steadily deepening sense of each other that required no announcement. Prentice, who was old enough to have watched enough people to know the signs when he saw them, said one evening to Teodoro in Spanish, which he was not supposed to know Violet spoke, "Another 6 weeks and one of them is going to do something about this." Violet, at the kitchen counter with her back to them, said in Spanish, "Mind your tortillas, Prentice." Prentice laughed so hard he knocked his coffee cup off the table. The summer brought visitors to the ranch. The nearest neighbor, a man named Birch who ran a smaller operation 3 miles north, came by to discuss the possibility of combined water access on a shared creek boundary, and he stayed for supper and was friendly and not uninteresting. His wife Marta came with him and took an immediate liking to Violet and invited her to the church social in town the following Sunday. Violet had been avoiding the social events in town out of a general wariness that had become habitual, but it had been 2 months since the contract was settled, and there was nothing legal holding over her anymore, and the social event was just a social event. So she said yes. The church social was held on the lawn of the half-shingled church, which had apparently been getting its other half of shingles in stages over the past several years, according to a fundraising effort that moved very slowly. There were tables with food and a fiddle player, and several children running in ways that suggested supervision had been abandoned as a practical matter. Violet went with Marta Birch, who introduced her to approximately everyone in the town in the course of an hour. Jonas was there. She hadn't known he was going. He was standing with two other ranchers near the corner of the church, talking in the serious way ranchers talk about grass and water and market prices, and he looked up when she arrived with Marta, and something shifted very briefly in his face before he looked back at his conversation. She talked to the women and ate the apple cake and watched the children run and felt, in a way that was both comfortable and slightly aching, that this town could be a place she stayed. That it was already partway a place she had been staying. That the process of making somewhere yours was not as different from the process of cooking bread as she had always assumed, a matter of warmth and time, and the particular chemistry of things that belong together. The fiddle player picked up a waltz around sunset, and several couples drifted onto the cleared section of lawn, and Marta Birch pulled her husband onto it with the practiced ease of a woman who knows her husband will resist, but also knows he'll be glad later. Violet watched them, and then she was aware of Jonas at her shoulder. "I don't dance," he said. He was not apologizing, he was stating a fact. "Neither do I," she said. "Good," he said. They stood side by side and watched the dancing in a silence that was entirely comfortable, the evening air cooling around them, the fiddle making something sweet and slightly melancholy out of the evening, and his shoulder was 3 inches from hers, and she was aware of those 3 inches with a precision that she found both slightly ridiculous and entirely understandable. "Are you glad you came?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He considered. "I generally find these things tolerable," he said. "Tonight I find it better than that." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the dancers. The last light of the day was on the side of his face, and it made him look less weathered and more warm, all the same elements of his face but lit differently. "Violet," he said, still watching the dancers. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something without," he paused, "without complicating what works, which is why I've been quiet about it, but I find I'm," another pause longer. "I find I'm not able to be entirely quiet about it any longer." She waited. The fiddle played. "I think about you," he said, "in a way that's past employer and employed. I'm aware that the situation makes that irregular, and I'm not asking anything of you. I want to say it because it's true and because I think you deserve to know the truth of things." Violet turned to look at him. He turned to look at her at the same moment, and they were closer than she'd realized. The 3 inches had become 1, and his face in the low light was very serious and very honest. "I think about you too," she said, "in the same way." The breath he let out was so small and so contained that anyone watching would not have seen it, but she was close enough to hear it, and she understood it was relief. "That's good," he said quietly. "It is," she agreed. They stood there for a moment, neither of them moving, the fiddle continuing its waltz, and then Marta Birch swept past with her husband and said, completely without subtlety, "Come dance, both of you, come, you can't stand at the edge all night," and they were both pulled, separately and laughing, onto the lawn. Jonas Ellsworth could not dance. He had said as much, and it was entirely true. But he made a genuine and earnest attempt at the waltz, and he stepped on her foot once and apologized with such complete sincerity that she laughed out loud, which was a sound she didn't hear from herself often enough. And he laughed too, and they were terrible at it together in a way that was better than being good at it alone. The drive back to the ranch in the dark was made in the wagon, the two of them side by side on the bench, the stars spectacular overhead in the manner they were only in places without much lamplight. Prentice and Teodoro had taken the horses back earlier, so it was just the two of them and the wagon and the dark road and the sound of the wheels on the earth. "I owe you for the $40, she said. "I haven't forgotten." "I know you haven't," he said. "You've never forgotten anything since I met you." "I want to talk about what happens when the debt is paid," she said. "In terms of my position here." He was quiet. "I'd like to stay," she said. "I'd like to stay as myself, not as a cook under wages, as something different from that." The wagon rolled on for a long moment. What did you have in mind?" he asked, and his voice had the careful quality of a man who had a very specific thing in mind himself and was trying not to lead the witness. "I don't know the correct way to say this," Violet said. "I've been careful for a long time. I've been very careful, and caution has served me well, but I think I've been applying it to things that don't require it, and I think you're one of those things." He pulled the wagon to a stop on the empty road. There was nothing around them but the dark Texas sky and the smell of night sage and the distant sound of cattle, and when he turned to look at her, she could see his face in the starlight, open and serious and waiting. "Jonas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I don't want to be careful with you." He reached over in the dark and took her right hand in both of his and held it, not dramatically, not urgently, just held it with the same steadiness with which he did everything, and she felt the warmth of his hands and the calluses on his palms and the solidity of him beside her on the bench. "Then don't be," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He was still for a moment, absorbing this, and then he settled, a small adjustment of his posture that said very clearly, "This is fine. This is good." And they sat like that on the stopped wagon in the middle of the dark road for long enough that the stars had shifted a perceptible amount before he said, "We should get back." "We should," she agreed, and neither of them moved for another minute. The rest of the summer moved differently after that. There was no single moment that announced the change, no formal declaration beyond the one they'd made on the dark road, but the quality of things shifted in ways that were unmistakable to everyone on the ranch. Prentice said nothing about this, which was itself remarkable. Teodoro beamed at every meal in a way that suggested he felt personally responsible. They talked more in the evenings after supper, when the lamps were low and the day's work was done. Jonas talked about the ranch in ways he hadn't before, the long term of it, the plans he had for the north pasture, the possibility of adding sheep, the way the land needed to be cared for across decades, not just seasons. Violet listened and offered her thoughts and found that he listened to them in return, actually listened, incorporated them, said things like, "I hadn't thought of it that way," or "That's a better plan than what I had." She talked about her life before the Hargrove contract, about the years of her childhood that had been good before her father's luck turned, about her mother who had died of fever when Violet was 12, and whose cornbread recipe she still carried in her head like a small inheritance. She talked about what she'd learned on the Hargrove ranch that had nothing to do with the contract and everything to do with the land, how to read cattle for health, how to judge grass for nutrition, how to feel the shift in a season before the air temperature announced it. Jonas listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave everything, and he asked questions at exactly the right places, and she discovered that being known by someone, being actually known, not performed at, was the most comfortable and the most frightening thing she had experienced in her adult life, which meant it was also the most valuable. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday in August, which was not a romantic day by any conventional measure, being in the middle of a week and in the middle of a particularly hot afternoon, and the setting was the kitchen garden, where Violet was trying to save a section of tomato plants from a blight. She noticed that morning and Jonas had come to help without being asked, and had been mostly useless at blight identification, but useful at carrying water. She had been showing him the affected leaves and explaining what she thought had caused it, and he had been listening with genuine attention and a slightly guilty look that said he was also using the occasion of looking at leaves as a reason to be close to her. And she looked up from the plant to find him looking at her rather than at the blight, and she said, "You're not looking at the tomatoes," and he said, "No," and then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was brief. It was entirely serious. It was so clearly a decision he had been considering for some time, and had finally simply made that she felt the weight of it, all the thinking behind it, and she kissed him back with equal seriousness, which probably looked somewhat funny in a kitchen garden over a sick tomato plant, but the tomatoes were not in a position to judge. When they stepped back, they both looked at the garden for a moment and then at each other. Violet felt something in her chest that was warm and solid and without edges, the feeling of something that had been waiting a long time to arrive, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, this is what it was supposed to feel like, and I am glad I waited long enough for it. I'll get more water, Jonas said. Yes, she said. Please. He went to get water. She went back to the tomato plants. And the day continued in a perfectly ordinary way, except that it was not ordinary at all, and they both knew it, and that knowing was the most extraordinary thing. Autumn on the Ellsworth Ranch was Violet's favorite season, and she said so in late September, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of tea while Jonas sat in the porch chair reading his survey papers, and he looked up and said, "Better than spring." "Better than spring," she said. "Spring is anxious. Autumn knows what it's done." He thought about this. "I hadn't thought of seasons as having emotional states," he said. "Everything has an emotional state," she said. "You just have to be paying attention." "What's winter?" "Honest," she said. "Nothing to hide behind." He set down his survey papers. The evening light was long and golden across the pasture, and the cattle were moving in the slow, contented drift of animals that had everything they needed, and the kitchen garden was finished for the season, but the winter squash were in storage, and the whole ranch smelled of the particular dry warmth of Texas October. "Violet," he said. "Yes. I'd like to ask you something." She looked at him. He had put down the papers, and he was sitting forward in the chair in a way that was slightly more deliberate than usual, with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and she realized with a start that Jonas Ellsworth, who was never visibly nervous, was currently nervous. "I'm 31 years old," he said, "and I've run this ranch for 9 years, and I've never been good at saying things directly when they matter, which is ironic because I prefer directness in other contexts." "You're being direct right now," she said. "I'm working up to it," he said. She set her tea down and waited. "I want you to stay," he said, not under any employment arrangement. "I want you to stay as my wife if you'll have me, and I want the ranch to be yours as much as it's mine, and I want—" He stopped and looked at her with a directness that had cost him something. "I want to know if you'll marry me." The evening was quiet around them. A mockingbird in the mesquite at the corner of the yard went through 3 or 4 different songs in quick succession, as if auditioning. Violet looked at the man in front of her. She thought about how she had arrived on a May afternoon with a forged name and a false letter and a branded wrist, and a plan that she had believed was adequate because it was all she had. She thought about how none of those things had been what mattered when she arrived. What had mattered was that he had looked at her face before he read the letter, and seen someone who needed work and not someone who wanted trouble, and fed her soup. She thought about how she had become, in the months since, something more whole than she had been when she arrived, not because he had fixed her. She had not been broken in the way that requires fixing, but because being in a place where she was known and respected and wanted had let the parts of her that had been drawn in and careful and defended slowly, at their own pace, find their full dimension again. She thought about the leather wrap on her wrist and the bowl of stew and the starlit road and the kitchen garden and the terrible waltz. "Yes," she said. "Jonas, yes." He exhaled slowly, the same contained relief she'd heard in his breath at the church social, but larger this time, and he stood and came to the steps and sat down next to her, close, and she leaned against him and his arm came around her shoulders. "Good," he said, in the low voice that was his most genuine register. "Good," she agreed. The mockingbird had settled on a single song now. The cattle moved in the pasture. The sunset was doing something spectacular over the western hills that neither of them was watching, being occupied with a more immediate and more important view. They were married in December of 1879, in the half-shingled church in Harlan Creek, which had by that point acquired 3/4 of its shingles due to the fundraising efforts of the congregation, who had been invigorated by the news of a wedding on the Ellsworth Ranch, and seen it as an occasion to also solve the shingle problem. Marta Birch organized both the wedding reception and the final shingle purchase, with the efficiency of a woman who runs 2 operations simultaneously and considers this normal. Violet wore a dress that was not white. She had never owned a white dress and did not intend to acquire one on the theory that it seemed impractical, but a deep blue that Marta Birch said matched her eyes and Teodoro said made her look like the illustrations he'd seen once of Spanish paintings, which he meant as the highest compliment he could offer. Jonas wore his best coat, which was dark and well-fitted and had been brushed within an inch of its life by Prentice, who took the occasion seriously. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Hollies, who was a small round man with a large voice and a genuine pleasure in conducting marriages, which he said was his favorite use of the pulpit. The church was full. Violet had not realized she knew so many people in Harlan Creek until they all showed up wearing their best clothes. She walked to the front of that church on her own 2 feet, as she had walked every mile of the last 8 months, and Jonas was waiting at the altar with an expression that was absolutely serious and absolutely warm. And when she reached him, he took her hand, her right hand, in the same way he had taken it on the dark road in July with both of his, and he held it. The vows were the traditional ones. Violet said hers clearly and without hesitation. Jonas said his in his low, direct voice, looking at her face, not at the congregation, not at the minister, at her. When the Reverend Holly said they were married, the entire church clapped in a way that suggested they were investing emotionally in this outcome, which Violet found both moving and slightly overwhelming. But Jonas squeezed her hand and she looked at him, and his face said it's all right. And so it was. The reception was in the Birch house, which was larger than the Ellsworth house, but currently contained approximately 40 people and the combined warmth of a Texas December crowd and several very good fires. There was food and a fiddle player, the same one from the summer social, who had a particular affection for waltzes, and Jonas and Violet danced again, and he still stepped on her foot once, but only once this time, which represented significant improvement. Prentice cried. He denied this categorically, but his eyes were red, and he kept clearing his throat in the vicinity of the dance floor. Teodoro danced with Marta Birch's youngest daughter, who was 19 and had come home from school in San Antonio for the holidays, and he did it with a self-consciousness that suggested this particular interaction would have its own story in time. Violet and Jonas drove home in the dark, as they had driven home in July, the wagon and the stars and the smell of night sage, but everything was different in the way that a thing is different when it has been named. She was his wife. He was her husband. The ranch ahead of them in the dark was theirs. These facts were simple and radical at once, and she held them carefully as they rode. At the house she went to light the lamp, and he came in behind her and stood in the kitchen in his good coat, and she turned from the lamp and looked at him, and he was looking at her with a steadiness that had depth to it, all the careful months behind it, all the things known and said and unsaid. Violet Ellsworth, he said. She had not thought about the name yet. She turned it over in her mind. It was not Clara Webb, which had been a useful fiction. It was not Violet Morgan, which had been the name she'd arrived with, the name attached to a contract and a brand and a history of being someone else's idea of a person. Violet Ellsworth was something new, something she'd arrived at under her own power. "I like it," she said. He smiled. It was not his rare full smile, but the quiet one, the one that lived in the corners of his mouth and his eyes and meant more than the full smile because it cost him more. And she crossed the kitchen, and she kissed him as his wife for the first time, and this time it was not brief. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a gentle one, as Texas winters went. The cold came, but it did not come with cruelty, and the ranch moved through December and January and February in the slow rhythm of the off-season, with the cattle manageable and the work reduced, and the evenings long and lamplit. Violet learned the house in the new way of being its owner rather than its employee. This was a small but significant shift in her relationship to the rooms. She rearranged the kitchen shelving, which had been organized by someone who was not a cook, and Jonas came in one morning to find nothing where he expected it, and stood in the kitchen with the expression of a man confronting a mild philosophical challenge. She showed him where everything now was. He tried it for 3 days and admitted the new arrangement was better. She took down the curtain over her old room off the kitchen and made it a proper storage room for dry goods, which it had always been better suited to. She moved her things, which had multiplied somewhat since May, owing to wages and Marta Birch's occasional gifting of fabric upstairs, into the room she shared with Jonas, which was larger and had 2 windows. She put the herb bed to sleep for the winter and planned the spring planting by the fire in the evenings, making notes in a small book, and Jonas sat across from her reading his survey papers, and the lamp burned between them and the dogs were on the rug, and outside the cold Texas night was dark and clear, and Violet thought, "This is what I am now. This is what I have built. This is mine." February brought a visitor she had not expected. A woman rode up the East Road on a gray horse, alone in the middle of the afternoon, and Violet in the kitchen heard the horse in the yard and went to the door. The woman was perhaps 50, weathered and straight-backed, with iron-gray hair and a look about her that suggested she had been in Texas longer than most of the landmarks. She swung down from her horse with a practiced ease and looked at Violet in the doorway. "You Violet Morgan?" she asked. "Violet Ellsworth," Violet said. The woman took that in. "Good," she said. "Heard you'd settled here. I'm Hattie Cates. My husband handled the contract resolution." She reached into her coat and produced an envelope. "He asked me to deliver this to you personally. He thought it should come to your hands." Violet came down the porch steps and took the envelope. Inside was the resolved contract, closed and stamped with the Abilene County seal, with a line through the name Hargrove and a final notation: "Obligation fully discharged, parties released of all claim," and a separate piece of paper shorter in a different hand which said, "The brand is not a legal document. It is not ownership. Whatever anyone told you, you were always free." She did not know who had written the second paper. She assumed it was the lawyer Cates, perhaps because he'd seen too many of these contracts and had needed to say something honest. She folded them both and held them. "Thank you," she said to Hattie Cates. Hattie Cates looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a woman who has seen hardship and recognizes it in others. "You all right?" she asked, not invasively but plainly. "Yes," Violet said. "I really am." Hattie Cates nodded, mounted her horse, and rode back down the East Road. Violet stood in the yard with the papers in her hand and looked up at the February sky, which was pale and clear and enormous in the way the Texas sky is enormous, and she breathed. Jonas came around the corner of the barn with a hammer and stopped when he saw her. He crossed the yard to her without speaking, and she handed him the papers. He read them, both of them, and then he handed them back. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and they stood in the February yard for a moment, and then she said, "I'm going to put these in the box in the bedroom," meaning the tin box she kept her important papers in, the few she had. "Good place for them," he said. She went inside. She put the papers in the box. She went back to the kitchen and started supper, and when Jonas came in later with cold, reddened hands from the hammer work, she poured him coffee without being asked, and he said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and neither of them said anything more about it because everything had already been said. The spring of 1880 came like a reward. The kitchen garden went back in with an expanded herb bed and a row of new seed from the general store that Abelson had started carrying, a seed catalog business that Violet took full advantage of. The cattle were healthy through the winter, and the new calves were coming steady, and Jonas added 4 new head of sheep to the north pasture on a trial basis, which he approached with the same careful consideration he brought to everything, and which he discussed with Violet at length before deciding. Prentice had a granddaughter who came to visit in April, a girl of 23 named Alma who was looking for work in the area, and Violet hired her as a kitchen helper within 3 days of meeting her, because Alma was organized and quick, and had opinions about bread making that were entirely correct. This expanded the kitchen operation significantly and freed Violet to spend more time outdoors, which she had always preferred. Teodoro had, as Violet had predicted, developed a significant attachment to Marta Birch's daughter Alina, who had returned to San Antonio after the wedding, but who was writing letters that Teodoro received with a happiness that was visible from across the yard. Prentice found this endlessly entertaining. The news of the ranch spreading to include a wife seemed to have opened the Ellsworth spread to more social traffic than it had previously experienced, and Jonas navigated this with slightly surprised patience, and Violet navigated it with a warmth that was real, because she had discovered that the careful solitude she'd maintained for years had been armor rather than preference, and once the armor was off, she was genuinely interested in people, in the specific texture of their lives and their stories, and their difficulties and their joys. Marta Birch became a real friend, the kind Violet had not had since childhood, and they visited each other regularly, and Marta taught her to make the German honey cake she had grown up with, and Violet taught her the ways of the kitchen garden that Marta had never quite gotten to produce what she wanted. In May, a year almost exactly from the day she'd arrived, Violet was in the garden in the late afternoon when she became aware that she had been tired in a particular way for several weeks, and that she had been quietly aware of certain other changes in her body that she had been too cautious to think about directly. And she sat back on her heels among the young tomato plants, and she did the counting she had been not quite doing, and she understood. She told Jonas that evening after supper, when Prentice and Teodoro had gone out and Alma had gone home to her lodging in town. She said it simply, sitting across the kitchen table, and she watched his face. He was still for a moment. Then something crossed his face that was not surprise. He was not a man who was often surprised, having generally been quietly paying attention, but something deeper than surprise, something that moved through him like weather and settled as a particular and profound kind of gladness. "Violet," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's—" He stopped. He had run out of what passed for adequate language, and she watched him know this and accept it with a grace that was entirely his own. "That's the best news I've ever gotten," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand that had taken hers on the dark road, and she held it. "Are you well?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said, "but well, I'm well." He held her hand and looked at her with an expression that contained everything: the year they'd had, the way she'd arrived, the leather strip and the liniment and the forged letter he'd folded into his pocket, the dance where he'd stepped on her foot, the kitchen garden and the dark road and the church with 3/4 of its shingles, all of it present in the way he looked at her. "We're going to need to add a room," he said. She laughed. She could not help it. It was such a practical and such a perfectly Jonas thing to say. "We have months," she said. "I know," he said, "but if I know now I can plan it properly instead of rushing." "Yes," she said. "You're right. Let's plan it properly." So they planned. Jonas began the addition to the house in June, working on it in the evenings with Teodoro helping and Prentice offering advice from a lawn chair in his expert advisory capacity. Violet watched the room take shape and felt the particular quality of anticipation that comes not from waiting but from building, from doing the actual work of creating the thing you want. The autumn of 1880 came full and golden and unhurried. Violet was large with child by September, and she ran the kitchen with Alma and managed the garden and refused to be treated as fragile, which Jonas understood was a matter of self-definition rather than stubbornness, and respected accordingly. Though he did occasionally appear at her elbow carrying things she had been about to carry herself in a way that was subtle enough to maintain the fiction that it was accidental. She loved him. She thought this often and directly, without embarrassment, the way you think a true thing when you are comfortable with it. She loved the quietness of him and the humor underneath the quiet, and the way he thought about things before he spoke, and the way he held her hand in the evenings when they were reading, and the way he talked to Roscoe in the barn, and the way he looked at the land, his land, their land now, with the steady love of someone committed to a long relationship. She loved the ranch itself, which had become hers in a way that still sometimes surprised her with its rightness. She had worked on other people's land for so long that owning a piece of the earth, or any piece of what the earth contained, had felt theoretical for years. But this was not theoretical. The kitchen garden was hers. The herb bed was hers. The particular morning light through the east window was hers to see every morning. The cattle in the far pasture, the horses in the paddock, the dogs on the rug, the half-shingled church in town, Marta Birch and her honey cake, the stars over the east road, all of it was woven into the life she had built, stitch by stitch, from the thin thread she'd arrived with. The baby arrived on a cold October morning, in the room where Violet and Jonas slept, attended by Marta Birch and the town doctor, a capable man named Aldridge who had been practicing in Harlan Creek for 15 years and had seen everything there was to see about arriving in the world. It was a boy. Jonas had been downstairs when it happened, pacing in the kitchen in the manner of a man who is trying to be useful and has been told firmly to stay out of the way. And when Marta Birch came down and told him he had a son, he went very still, and then he went upstairs without saying anything. Violet was tired and warm and propped up on the pillows, and the baby was in her arms, and when Jonas came through the door he stopped for a moment in the frame, looking at the two of them, and his face in that moment was the most open she had ever seen it. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was very small and very pink, and was looking at the world with the unfocused intensity of the newly arrived. Jonas put one careful finger against the baby's hand, and the baby's hand closed around it with the particular grip of infants who are stronger than they appear. "Hello," Jonas said, very quietly to his son. Violet watched him. She had thought about this moment, in the abstract way she had let herself think about good things since she arrived on the ranch, and she had imagined it as emotional in the large, dramatic sense. But it was not dramatic. It was simply immense, which was different, the way a landscape is immense without being theatrical. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Jonas looked at the baby for a moment. "I thought Thomas," he said. "If you agree, my grandfather's name." "Thomas," she said, trying it. The baby's grip on Jonas's finger tightened. "I think he agrees," she said. Jonas looked at her, and the quiet gladness she had seen on his face in May was present again, but larger, the way a fire is larger when it has more room to burn. "Thomas Ellsworth," he said. "Thomas Ellsworth," she agreed. Prentice wept when he was told. He denied it. He was consistent about this. Teodoro rode into town that same afternoon to send a letter to Alina in San Antonio, and though the letter was ostensibly about the birth of the Ellsworth baby, it was also understood by everyone on the ranch to be a letter about other things entirely. And by the following March, Alina Birch would be in Harlan Creek for good, and she and Teodoro would be married in the same church where Jonas and Violet had been, with the remaining quarter of the shingles finally installed. The fundraising effort having been energized by a second wedding, and the general community momentum that comes from a town that has decided things are going well. The Ellsworth Ranch changed and grew as the 1880s continued. The north pasture with the sheep proved successful, and Jonas expanded it. Violet's kitchen garden became a genuine small enterprise that supplied the general store with preserved goods, which she managed with Alma's help, and which generated enough additional income to justify Alma's permanent employment. The addition to the house became 2 rooms, the second one added when it became clear they were going to need it. Thomas grew from a pink and gripping infant into a walking child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady way of regarding the world, and he had strong opinions about the horses from the moment he was able to voice them, which was early. Jonas began teaching him to ride at an age that Marta Birch considered premature, and that Violet considered perfectly appropriate, and that Thomas considered nothing short of wonderful. In 1883, Violet had a daughter they named Clara, which was a joke between herself and Jonas that she explained to no one, and which Jonas understood completely, and the name given to a daughter who would never need to be anyone but herself was the best use Violet could think of for the name she'd once borrowed. Clara arrived with the same full-force personality that characterized the Ellsworth women generally, which is to say she had opinions from birth and expressed them clearly. She and Thomas were different as two children could be, Thomas careful and observant, Clara immediate and decisive, and they got along with the productive friction of people who are well matched in stubbornness if not in method. The brand on Violet's wrist had faded over the years as scar tissue does. It had not disappeared. She had not expected it to disappear. She wore the leather wrap still, out of habit and out of preference, though she no longer pressed it against her skirt when she moved through the world. She showed it to her daughter, when Clara was old enough to ask about it, without shame and without drama, and she explained what it was and how it had happened and what it meant and did not mean. She said, "There are things that are done to us that do not define us, and there are people in the world who will tell you what you are and what you're worth, and the work of a life is to know the difference between those people and the truth." Clara listened to this with the focused attention of a 7-year-old who is filing everything away. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "Yes," Violet said, "and then you came here." "Eventually," Violet said, "after some time. And then you and Papa." "And then your papa asked what I needed," Violet said, "and did not ask very many things beyond that at first, and it turned out that was exactly the right number of questions." Clara thought about this. "I'd have asked more questions," she said. "I know," Violet said. "You would have gotten to the point faster too." "Yes," Clara agreed, with the complete confidence of a 7-year-old who has never doubted her own approach. The summer of 1885 was a hot one, the hottest in the valley since before Jonas had come to the ranch, and the water management became a real concern. Jonas and Birch and 2 other ranchers from the surrounding area formed a water cooperative that Jonas had been discussing in principle for years, and Violet sat in on those meetings at Jonas's request and offered the perspective of someone who had watched a badly managed water supply destroy a cattle operation. The Hargrove spread had nearly failed one summer for exactly this reason, and her input shaped the cooperative agreement in ways that the other ranchers acknowledged with the slightly surprised respect of men realizing they had been missing a perspective that had been right there all along. Thomas was 5 that summer and spent most of it following Teodoro around the ranch, with an intensity of purpose that suggested he was conducting a comprehensive study. Teodoro, who now lived in a house of his own on the north edge of the ranch property with Alina and their daughter Maria, had become the kind of man his younger self might have been surprised to see coming steady and skilled and deeply happy, someone who had found exactly where he belonged and committed to it fully. Prentice died in the autumn of 1885. He was old, he himself had lost count and claimed different ages on different days, ranging from 70 to 83, and he went in his sleep in the bunkhouse on a clear October night, the same kind of night that had always been his favorite. The ranch mourned him in the practical and real way of a working community that has lost one of its essential people. Jonas dug the grave himself, and the whole of Harlan Creek came to the service. Violet spoke at the service. She said that Prentice was the first person on the Ellsworth ranch who had made room for her at the table, literally and otherwise, on the day she arrived, and that she had decided in that moment that a place where a stranger was made room for without ceremony was a place worth staying in. She said she was grateful to have learned what she'd learned from him, which included the importance of a good story, the value of experience, and the necessity of admitting when you were wrong about the new arrangement of the kitchen shelves. There was some laughter and some tears, and Marta Birch provided enough food for twice the number of people present, as Marta Birch always did. They hired a new hand the following spring, a young man named Elias from a ranch further west, who was 20 and uncertain of himself, and reminded Violet of Teodoro as he'd been when she arrived. She watched Jonas handle this with the same patience he brought to everything practical, fair, direct, and she watched the young man find his footing in the same quiet way she had found hers 6 years before, in the warmth and the order and the basic human dignity of a ranch that was run on honest principles. The Hargrove Ranch outside Abilene failed in 1886. She read it in a newspaper that Birch brought from town, a brief notice about the Hargrove cattle operation dissolving due to debt and mismanagement. She read it once and set the paper down and said nothing about it to anyone. She did not feel triumph, which she had once thought she might. She felt something more neutral than that, the way you feel when a weather system finally moves on, not glad for the storm, not sorry it's over, just aware that the air has changed. Jonas came in from the barn and found her with the newspaper, and he looked at her face and said, "What is it?" "Nothing important," she said. "Old news from Abilene." He looked at the paper and then at her. He didn't push. He said, "I'm going to start the evening check." And he went back out, and when he came in for supper he sat across from her and served himself and said, "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "Genuinely." "Good," he said, and passed her the bread. This was what love was, she had decided after 6 years of having it. Not the large moments, though the large moments were real and important, but this, the bread passed across the table, the checking in, the willingness to ask and then to believe the answer. The accumulation of ordinary days into which the extraordinary had been so thoroughly woven that you could not separate them. Could not say here is the important part and here is the everyday part. Because it was all important, all of it. The stew, and the leather strip, and the dark road, and the waltz, and the forged letter in the breast pocket, and the kitchen garden, and Thomas's grip on Jonas's finger, and the morning light through the east window. She had arrived with a branded wrist and a forged name, and enough money to last until she could find something real, and she had found something real, and it had been more real than she had known how to want for. Thomas Ellsworth, at 8 years old, had developed a specific and detailed love of the kitchen garden that Violet had cultivated, and he would come after his morning lessons and ask her what needed doing. She gave him real work, not work invented to keep a child occupied, but actual necessary tasks that contributed to the garden's function. He weeded and he watered, and he learned to read the plants the way she had learned to read them, for health and need and season. "Mama," he said one afternoon in the summer of 1888, crouched over the herb bed with the particular focus he gave everything. "When you came here, did you know you were going to stay?" Violet was thinning the carrot rose. She paused and thought about the question honestly, because Thomas always deserved honest answers. "No," she said. "I hoped I might be able to, but I didn't know." "What made you decide?" She thought about this. She thought about the soup and the leather strip and the dark road and all the things in between. "Someone asked me what I needed instead of asking a lot of other things first," she said, "and I thought that was worth staying for." Thomas considered this with the solemn attention of an 8-year-old who is building a world view. "That's a good reason," he said. "I think so," she said. "Papa's like that," Thomas said, going back to the herbs. "Yes," Violet said, "he is." In 1889, Violet was 34 years old, and she had lived on the Ellsworth Ranch for 10 years. The anniversary was not marked with any formal ceremony, because that was not the shape of how she and Jonas lived, but she was aware of it. 10 years since the May afternoon on the East Road with her bag and her $11 and her forged name. 10 years since the soup in the kitchen. 10 years of this particular life, which had not been given to her, but which she had walked toward and earned and built. She was in the kitchen on the morning that occurred to her as the anniversary, the exact date in May, a Tuesday again, and Jonas came in for his coffee before the morning check and found her standing at the window looking out at the pasture where the cattle were moving in the early light, and he poured his own coffee and came to stand beside her. "What are you looking at?" he said. "Everything," she said. He looked out the window with her. The ranch in the early May morning was exactly what it had always been and completely what it had become, and neither of those things contradicted the other. The barn, still red and solid. The fence lines, straight and mended. The cattle moving. The kitchen garden already showing green, Thomas having put the early seeds in 2 weeks ago with the care of someone who has been taught how things grow. I arrived 10 years ago today, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had remembered. She could tell he'd remembered. Long walk, he said. Worth it, she said. He turned from the window and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And 10 years of mornings were in that look. All the coffee cups and the bread and the dogs on the rug and the survey papers, and the lamplight and the dance and the child asleep upstairs, and the daughter who would be up in 20 minutes demanding breakfast with the unapologetic energy of a 6-year-old who has never once doubted her welcome. Jonas put his coffee cup down on the windowsill and took her face in both hands and kissed her in the morning kitchen, in the way that was not the brief seriousness of the kitchen garden or the tenderness of the dark road, but something that contained both of those and the years on top of them, a kiss that knew its own history. When he stepped back, she was looking at him with something in her face that she knew was visible and didn't try to hide, because she had stopped hiding things from this man a long time ago and did not intend to start again. $9 a month, she said. He blinked. What? That's what you offered me, she said. $9 a month in a room with a vent instead of a window. The look on his face was the full smile now, the rare one. You should have negotiated, he said. I ended up doing all right, she said. Yes, he said. I'd say so. From upstairs, Clara's voice arrived at the volume of someone who has been waiting a reasonable amount of time and considers that time now past. Jonas picked up his hat. Violet picked up her coffee cup. Thomas came in through the back door with mud on his boots and the morning's urgency of something he'd found in the garden. Outside, Teodoro was crossing the yard from the barn with Elena beside him and little Maria on her hip. Elias was saddling his horse at the paddock. The east road ran straight and red in the morning light, and the cattle were in the right pasture, and the fence lines were straight, and the kitchen garden was green, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the beginning of another day. Violet Morgan Ellsworth stood in the kitchen of the ranch that was hers, and felt the full and unhidden weight of a life that had arrived at its own true shape. And she was glad, not in spite of the walk to get here, but including it, because you cannot fully value what you have arrived at without understanding what the road was. The years settled into the ranch like good weather. Thomas grew into a young man who had his mother's eye for plants and his father's patience with animals, and who announced at 15 that he intended to study agriculture in a way that would let him come back and improve the ranch, which he said with such a complete matter-of-factness that neither Jonas nor Violet could find anything to say except that they thought that was a very good plan. Clara announced at 14 that she intended to do something Jonas privately believed would involve considerable argument with other people, which was accurate, as Clara eventually read law in a time when women reading law was technically impossible and practically inevitable, at least for Clara. The Ellsworth Ranch at the turn of the decade was a different scale than it had been in 1879, larger in acreage and in cattle, and in the reputation of the people who ran it. Jonas had become one of the respected ranchers of the valley, known for fair dealing and sound management, and Violet had become known in Harlan Creek for things that ranged from the kitchen garden preserves to the water cooperative work, to the occasional very pointed opinion offered at town meetings in the church, which had all of its shingles now and had added a small bell tower. She never went back to Abilene. She had no reason to. The contract was settled and the Hargrove operation was gone, and the people she might have wanted to find there were either found or unfindable, and her life had grown so thoroughly in the direction of the East Road and the Red Clay Valley, and the morning light through the bedroom windows that backward was simply a direction the compass had, not one she needed to travel. The branded wrist she carried for the rest of her life, a scar that faded but never vanished, a mark she had not chosen and did not owe apology for. She wore the leather wrap on certain days, not all days, depending on her mood and the weather and the particular quality of the day. On the days she didn't wear it, the scar was visible, and she made no effort to hide it. And if anyone looked, she looked back with the steady certainty of a woman who had long since stopped requiring the world's permission to be exactly what she was. Jonas never mentioned the brand except once, in 1891, when Thomas was 11 and had asked his father about it directly. With the directness of a child who has been raised in a house where direct questions get direct answers, and Jonas had said, simply and without drama, "It was done to your mother without her consent, when she was very young, by people who believed they had a right to her that they did not have. She has worn it with more grace than most people could manage, and it has never for a single day defined who she is." Thomas had nodded, filed this away, and gone back to whatever he'd been doing. It was enough. On a warm October evening in 1891, 12 years after Violet had walked the East Road for the first time, she and Jonas sat on the porch steps after supper, in the manner they had always sat on porch steps after supper when the day allowed it, with the dogs at their feet and the cattle in the far pasture, and the stars beginning to appear over the western hills. Thomas was in the barn. Clara was inside doing her lessons with the focused intensity of someone who considers the allocation of lamplight to academics a personal priority. The ranch was quiet in the specific way it was quiet at the end of a completed day. Jonas had his arm around her shoulders. She was leaning into his side. The evening air was exactly right, not cold, not warm, the particular temperature of an autumn evening that has no argument with you. "I've been thinking," he said. She said. "About the north pasture fence line. There's a section near the creek that needs Jonas," she said. "Yes. Is that what you've been thinking about?" A pause. "No," he said. "Not exactly." "What then?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how to say something with the precision it deserved. "I was thinking about how different everything is from what I expected," he said. "When you first came, I expected a cook. I expected to find someone competent and straightforward and to go on running the ranch in roughly the same shape it was in. And instead," she said, "and instead," he said, "everything is a completely different shape, a better shape." I just wanted to say that. I don't say it enough. Violet looked out at the pasture where the cattle were moving slow in the last light. She thought about May 1879, the stage, the dust, the $11, the forged name. She thought about the soup. She thought about the leather strip and the lamp and the waltz and the dark road. "You say it enough," she said. "You say it in the right ways." He pressed a kiss to her hair. She closed her eyes for a moment and felt the weight and warmth of everything she had built against her back. The stars came out one by one over the Ellsworth ranch, and the dogs were peaceful. And inside the house, Clara was reading by lamplight, and Thomas was coming in from the barn with hay in his hair and the good tired look of someone who has done real work. And the kitchen smelled of the evening supper, and the fence lines in the darkness were straight and held, and the cattle in the far pasture had everything they needed. And so, entirely and without reservation, did she.